The last order at Marlowe's Diner. I never thought a late-night shift at Marlowe's Diner could go wrong. It was just a small-town place, the kind where the coffee never stops flowing, and the regulars always sit in the same booths. As a waitress, I'd seen all kinds of things. People coming in after a night of partying, truckers looking for a break, and lonely souls seeking comfort in a hot meal. But that night, something felt off the moment I walked in. It was just past midnight, and the air inside the diner was thick with a fog that seemed to seep in through the cracked windows. The lights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the vinyl booths. The place was mostly empty, just a few scattered customers nursing their coffee and flipping through newspapers. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered like the taste of stale coffee. Marlowe's Diner had been around for decades, always a staple of the town, and I'd been working there for almost a year. The old man who owned the place, Carl Marlowe, was a quiet, grizzled man in his 70s who spent most of his time in the back, cooking up his famous meatloaf or stirring the daily soup specials. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried a weight to it, like he was hiding something. That night, he was in his usual spot, wiping down the counter with a rag. As I clocked in, he barely looked up. "Busy night," he muttered, his voice low and rough. I nodded, trying to ignore the hairs standing on the back of my neck. There was something about his tone that made me uncomfortable. It was as if he knew something I didn't. Something was wrong with the diner, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I grabbed my apron and made my way to the tables. The bell above the door jingled as a man walked in, his heavy boots scraping the floor as he approached the counter. He was tall, with a weathered face and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to look right through me. He had the look of someone who'd been on the road for far too long, someone who might have seen a little too much of the world. "Coffee," he said, his voice gruff, without looking up. I poured him a cup, keeping my distance. There was something unsettling about his presence, like he was waiting for something. He barely touched his drink, his fingers drumming against the edge of the counter as he stared out the window into the foggy night. The other customers had begun to leave, one by one, until the diner was nearly empty. It was almost 1 a.m. when the man finally spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice still flat, "this place has a reputation." I raised an eyebrow. "Reputation?" He turned to face me, his eyes narrowing. "You've never heard of the Marlowe curse, have you?" I laughed, trying to brush off the eerie tone of his words. "A curse? No, I think you're mistaken." The man leaned forward, his face now inches from mine. "You don't believe me now, but you will. Soon enough." He gave me a dark smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Every night, someone orders the special. They always regret it." I was about to ask him what he meant when the bell above the door jingled again. A woman entered, her face obscured by a large hood, but there was something strange about her walk. She moved with an almost unnatural grace, gliding across the floor as if she were floating. She sat at the far booth, her eyes scanning the room as if she were searching for something or someone. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The man at the counter seemed to notice her too, his expression darkening. "It's too late for her to be here," he muttered under his breath. I was starting to get freaked out. "Who is she?" The man just shook his head. "You'll see." I didn't know what to make of his words, but before I could ask anything more, Carl came out of the kitchen, his face pale. He looked at the woman in the booth, then back at me. "Get her order now," he barked. There was no mistaking the urgency in his voice, and for the first time since I started working there, I saw fear in Carl's eyes. I walked over to the woman, my heart racing in my chest. She didn't acknowledge me as I approached, but her eyes followed my every move. I tried to speak, but when I opened my mouth, my voice caught in my throat. The air around her was colder now, and I could see my breath misting in the space between us. "Can I take your order?" I forced out, my voice shaking. The woman looked up slowly, her face still hidden beneath the hood. She smiled and I froze. Her teeth were sharp, unnaturally white, and her eyes, when they met mine, were a pale, milky white, as if she had no pupils. Her smile widened, and she spoke in a voice that sent a jolt of fear straight to my core. "I'll have the special." I nodded quickly, retreating to the kitchen to tell Carl. He was already there, pacing, his face twisted with worry. "No," he said sharply. "Don't serve her the special. You don't know what it does." Before I could respond, the woman stood and walked toward the counter, her movements still eerily smooth. She was faster than I'd anticipated, and before I knew it, she was standing right behind me, her cold breath brushing against my neck. "She knows," the man at the counter said, his voice low. "She's here for the one thing she's been searching for." I turned to Carl, but he was no longer looking at me. His eyes were locked on the woman, and his expression was one of regret. "You should have left when you had the chance," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a strange night at Marlowe's. It was something far darker, and I had just become part of it. The woman reached for the menu, her fingers long and slender, and she pulled the special off the board. "It's time," she whispered. The lights flickered, and I heard the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor behind me. The man at the counter got up, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. I turned to look, but it was too late. The fog outside the diner had thickened, and the doors slammed shut, trapping us inside. The woman's smile stretched wider as the room grew colder. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The diner was no longer just a place of greasy food and late-night coffee. It was a prison, and there was no way out. That was my last night at Marlowe's Diner. I never went back after that. No one ever saw Carl again either. Some say the diner is still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to walk through its doors. I wonder who the next person will be. Midnight at Cindy's Diner. I should have just kept driving. I was on a long-haul trip across the country, the kind of mind-numbing journey where the radio turns to static, and the road stretches endlessly ahead like a dark ribbon through nowhere. It was past midnight when I saw the neon sign glowing in the distance. Cindy's Diner, open 24 hours. My stomach grumbled, and exhaustion clawed at my brain. A hot meal and a cup of coffee sounded too good to pass up. The diner sat on the side of an otherwise empty stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but fields and darkness. It looked like something out of a 1950s postcard. Checkered floors, chrome stools, and a long counter gleaming under dim overhead lights. The neon sign buzzed softly, flickering like it was struggling to stay awake. I pushed open the door, and a little bell jingled overhead. Inside, it smelled of grease, coffee, and something else. Something faintly metallic like rusted iron. There were only a few patrons. An old man hunched over a cup of coffee at the far end of the counter, a trucker gnawing on a piece of toast, and a woman in a red dress sitting alone in a booth, staring blankly at the table. A waitress appeared from behind the counter. She was young, with a tired face and hollow eyes. Her name tag read Margot. "Take a seat anywhere, hon," she said, her voice flat. I slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl seat cracked beneath me. Margot shuffled over and handed me a menu. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yeah, please." She poured from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there for hours. I took a sip. It was bitter and thick, but I needed it. I scanned the menu. Burgers, pancakes, eggs, typical greasy spoon fare. But something felt off. The descriptions were just slightly strange. Instead of cheeseburger, it said meat patty special. Instead of grilled chicken, it just said the favorite. I ordered a burger and fries, deciding not to overthink it. As I waited, I noticed the other customers weren't eating. The trucker just stared at his plate. The woman in red hadn't touched her food. Even the old man at the counter wasn't drinking his coffee anymore, just staring into it, like something might crawl out. A low murmur filled the diner, like voices just out of earshot. The air felt thick, heavy. My skin prickled, like unseen eyes were watching. Margot returned with my plate. The burger was massive, the meat almost too red beneath a toasted bun. The fries were piled high, but they had a strange, almost waxy sheen to them. "Enjoy," she said, but there was no warmth in it. I hesitated before taking a bite. The patty was juicy, but the taste was wrong. Like it had been seasoned with something bitter, something that didn't belong in food. The texture was too soft. I set it down, suddenly losing my appetite. The woman in red finally moved. She looked up at me, her eyes dull and unfocused. "Don't eat it," she whispered. I froze. "What?" She shook her head quickly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "They don't like it when you don't finish," she said, her voice barely above a breath. A chair scraped against the floor as the old man stood up. His eyes were wide, wild, darting between me and the waitress. "You gotta go," he muttered. "You gotta go now." The trucker set his fork down carefully, as if any sudden movement might break the spell hanging over the diner. Margot stepped out from behind the counter, her face eerily calm. "Everything okay?" she asked. The old man swallowed hard. "He ain't one of them," he said, his voice shaking. Margot's expression didn't change, but I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. "That's so?" she murmured. The door to the kitchen creaked open. A tall man in a cook's uniform stepped out. His name tag read Cindy. His arms were too long, his fingers thin and spidery. His eyes too black, too deep, fixed on me. "Is there a problem with the meal?" he asked, his voice too smooth, too measured. The woman in red shook her head violently. The trucker pushed his plate away. The old man backed toward the door. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I stood up, my legs stiff, unsteady. "No problem," I said quickly. "Just not as hungry as I thought." Cindy took a slow step forward. "We don't waste food here," he said. The other customers shrank back as Margot and Cindy blocked the only exit. I turned to the old man, desperate. "What's going on?" His lips trembled. "They need fresh meat." The realization hit me like ice water. The meat patty special. The strange texture. The people who never left. I bolted. Cindy lunged. His fingers brushed my shoulder, ice cold and claw-like. I crashed into the counter, sending coffee cups flying. Margot grabbed at me, but I shoved past her, knocking over a stool. The trucker threw his plate, shattering it against the floor. The woman in red screamed. I hit the door at full force, shoving it open, and stumbled outside into the cold night. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. Behind me, the diner door creaked open. Cindy stepped onto the porch, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "You'll be back," he called. His voice echoed, too loud in the empty night. The old man and the trucker rushed past me, their cars already running. The woman in red hesitated. "You should burn it," she said softly. Then she was gone. I didn't look back. I peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching. The neon sign flickered in my mirror as I sped away. Cindy's Diner, open 24 hours. The glowing letters twisted, warped, rearranging themselves for just a second. Cindy's Diner, always hungry. Then the sign buzzed, flickered, and went dark. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. The Last Stop Diner. It was past midnight when I saw the neon glow of the Last Stop Diner flickering through the dense fog that had settled over the highway. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy, my stomach empty. There wasn't another sign of civilization for miles, and my gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. I pulled into the cracked parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The diner was small, an old-school joint with a red and white color scheme. A large, open 24 hours sign buzzed against the quiet night. The lot had a few other cars, but something about them felt off. They were old, covered in dust, like they hadn't moved in years. I stepped inside, a bell chiming above the door. The warm, greasy scent of fried food and stale coffee hit me instantly. The place had a retro charm, checkered floors, vinyl booths, a long counter with red swivel stools. The jukebox in the corner played something faint and distorted, a tune I couldn't quite place. A waitress stood behind the counter, her uniform crisp but outdated, like something from the 1950s. Her name tag read Marge. She had a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Welcome to the last stop. What'll it be, Han? I slid into a booth and picked up the laminated menu. The options were simple: burgers, fries, pancakes, and something called the house special. My stomach rumbled. I ordered a burger, fries, and coffee. Marge's smile widened. A little too much. Good choice. We'll get that right up for you. She disappeared into the kitchen, the doors swinging behind her. I glanced around. A few customers were scattered through the diner. A man in a faded suit staring at his coffee, a trucker hunched over his plate, a woman sitting in the farthest booth, her back to me. None of them spoke. None of them even looked up. The jukebox crackled. The lights flickered. A cold draft brushed against my neck, though there was no open window. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter. Something felt wrong. Minutes passed. My coffee arrived, steaming and black. I took a sip and nearly gagged. It was bitter, with an underlying metallic taste. I set it down and pushed it away just as the kitchen doors swung open again. A cook emerged, carrying my plate. His white apron was stained, his hands large and calloused. He set the food down without a word and disappeared back into the kitchen. The burger smelled delicious, but as I lifted it, something red dripped onto my plate. The patty was oozing, far too raw. I pulled the bun apart, my stomach twisting. The meat was wrong. It wasn't ground beef. It was fibrous, sinewy, with something that looked like a vein running through it. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't cow. A movement caught my eye. The woman in the far booth had turned her head slightly, just enough that I could see her profile. Her skin was pale, too smooth, her eyes too dark. She smiled, her lips splitting open wider than humanly possible. I shoved the plate away and stood abruptly. Every eye in the diner turned toward me at once. The trucker, the man in the suit, Marge behind the counter, their heads tilted in eerie unison. Something wrong, Han? Marge's voice was light, almost teasing, but her smile had stretched impossibly wide, revealing too many teeth. I backed toward the door. I have to go. The man in the suit stood. So did the trucker. Their movements were stiff, unnatural. The woman in the booth crawled over the table, her limbs bending oddly, her neck snapping as she turned to face me fully. I bolted. My hands slammed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The neon glow outside had vanished. The windows reflected only darkness. Marge sighed. Shame. You almost made it. The other patrons advanced, their faces distorted, features shifting like melting wax. The trucker's jaw unhinged, his tongue lolling out in a grotesque, wet slither. The woman in the booth let out a guttural growl, her arms extending, fingers stretching into long, curved talons. I scrambled backward, knocking over a chair. My heart pounded. The kitchen doors burst open. The cook was there, his apron now soaked through with red. In his hands he held a slab of meat, fresh, dripping. Something with fingers. Looks like we'll need a new house special, he grunted. The jukebox wailed, a high-pitched, distorted screech. The lights flickered wildly. The last thing I saw was Marge, stepping closer, her mouth widening, her voice a syrupy coo. Don't worry, Han. You won't go to waste. I never should have stopped at Dale's Diner. It was one of those nights where exhaustion sat heavy on my shoulders, pressing me down like an iron weight. I had been driving for hours on an empty stretch of highway, the kind where the darkness seemed to swallow the world whole. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and the gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. When I spotted the neon sign flickering in the distance, glowing a sickly red and yellow, I thought I had found a lifeline. The diner was a relic from another era, all chrome and checkered tiles, the kind of place that looked as if it hadn't changed since the 50s. The open 24 hours sign buzzed weakly in the cold night air. A few cars sat parked out front, but the lot was eerily quiet. I stepped inside, the door jingling with an old-fashioned bell. The smell of burnt coffee and greasy food hung in the air, mixed with something else, something rancid, like spoiled meat. A waitress stood behind the counter, chewing gum lazily. Her uniform was a dull blue, stained at the hem. Her name tag read Trudy. She didn't greet me, just stared with glassy eyes, like I had interrupted something. There were a few other patrons scattered around. An old man hunched in the corner, sipping from a chipped mug, a trucker with a face carved from stone, and a young woman sitting alone at the counter, her nails tapping on the surface in an anxious rhythm. I slid into a booth near the window. The vinyl was cracked, and something sticky clung to the tabletop. A laminated menu sat in front of me, the edges curled and yellowed. What'll it be? Trudy's voice was flat, her gum popping between her teeth. I scanned the menu, but something about it felt off. The font was strange, the dish name slightly wrong. Instead of Cheeseburger Deluxe, it read Meat Special Freshly Caught. Instead of pancakes, it said Griddle Cakes with Secret Topping. My stomach growled, pushing aside the creeping unease. I ordered a coffee and a burger. Trudy didn't write it down. She just smirked and walked away, vanishing into the dimly lit kitchen. I glanced at the young woman at the counter. She was staring at me now, her face pale, her lips moving soundlessly. I frowned. Get out. Her voice barely carried across the room, but I heard it. She wasn't looking at me anymore, just straight ahead, eyes locked on the kitchen doors. Before I could react, the old man in the corner coughed violently, a wet, gurgling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. He hunched over, hacking into his napkin. A dark red stain spread across the paper. Trudy returned, placing my coffee down with a hard clink. You might want to drink that fast, hon. Things move quickly round here. She winked. I hesitated. The coffee smelled strange, like burnt sugar mixed with something metallic. I wrapped my hands around the mug, trying to shake the unease gnawing at my gut. The kitchen doors swung open. A man emerged, carrying a plate with my burger. His apron was smeared with something dark. His fingers curled tightly around the plate's edges. The burger didn't look right. The patty was thick, almost unnaturally so, and something reddish oozed from the side. The bun looked soggy, like it had absorbed too much liquid. My appetite vanished. The young woman at the counter was shaking her head furiously, her fingers clawing at the counter like she wanted to bolt but couldn't. I pushed the plate away. I changed my mind. Trudy's smile widened. That's not how it works, sugar. You ordered the special. You eat the special. The trucker in the corner let out a deep sigh and set down his fork. He turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes weren't human. They were black, glossy, like twin pools of ink. His mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing too many teeth, jagged and yellowed. My stomach lurched. I looked around. The old man had stopped moving. His head was tilted at a sickening angle, his jaw slack. No one else reacted. I stood up quickly, my chair scraping against the floor. I need to go. My voice cracked. Trudy just laughed. The kitchen doors burst open. A man in a butcher's apron stepped out, carrying something in his arms. It was raw. It was dripping. It had fingers. The bile rose in my throat. Fresh meat, just in, the cook called, grinning. His teeth were serrated. I turned and bolted. I crashed through the diner's door, the bell jangling wildly. My car was the only thing I could think about. My keys, where were my keys? My hands trembled as I yanked them from my pocket, jamming them into the lock. From inside the diner, Trudy stood at the window watching me. Her head tilted slowly to the side, too far to be normal. The trucker and the young woman were standing now, too. But the young woman, she wasn't trying to stop me anymore. She was smiling. The last thing I saw before I peeled out of the parking lot was the neon sign flickering above the door. The words had changed. Dale's Diner, always looking for fresh customers.